We are having this webinar as part of the Coalición de los Dispuestos series connected with the Fundación Borincana. I will introduce the guests shortly. Wanted to make sure that people know to mute their mics and to turn off their videos. There is a chat feature associated with this particular setup that can be utilized to submit questions. So wanted to make sure that you're invited to submit questions as we go along, and we will try and take these and answer them toward the end. Wanted to mention Jose Roman is on the call today, but he has been ill and his voice is a little bit weak. So we're going to try and save his voice and his health as much as we can. So I think in that I will probably ask Paul to maybe take the first crack at answering most of the questions that we've talked about for this webinar, so that at least Jose will be saved some of the setup for the questions and the answer. With that, I think people can see the screen and can see me on video here. Let me just quickly move forward. Just a reminder, the Coalición de los Dispuestos, if you are a member, thank you. If you would like to become a member, very simple. It's a free social and professional network that we're running out of the new foundation. And really, it's the idea of getting people together and bringing different expertise and in a social and at least for now, an informal network. So let me just quickly introduce the speakers on today's call. Jose Roman Morales is the former chairman and one of the original commissioners of the Puerto Rico Energy Commission, and he's graciously agreed to talk to us today on the subject of future regulation in Puerto Rico. The second guest is Paul Walker. Paul is a regulatory expert and an executive director of ConservAmerica, and has done a number of interesting things, which we may learn a bit more about in the context of this call. Paul and I actually just submitted yesterday responses to the request for public comment by the Puerto Rico Energy Commission, which I think they'll be public, but we'll share them later in this week. Okay. So just a quick reminder, if you've joined the call, could you mute your mic? I don't seem to have the technical capability to actually turn people's mics off, so appreciate it if you could regulate that yourself. I am the host. I am Tom King. I'm the president and founding director of the Fundación Borincana Foundation, and looking forward to, I guess, getting this going. So let me start by quickly setting this up. Energy technology is evolving rapidly. Climate change is driving priorities, more so than in Puerto Rico. The understanding of energy insecurity is growing, and I really mean that from a popular standpoint. And of course, AI, blockchain, machine learning are enabling new forms barely yet contemplated. All of these things are putting pressure on the utility model. So,
yeah, you are busy. I don't know.
Sorry, could you put your phone on mute? Okay. I'm not sure I can do that. Anyway, recognizing that the different markets are going to evolve at different times and in different ways, I'd like to ask my guest how they envision the energy infrastructure system in the future, and I'll ask Paul first.
Thanks. So for everyone's knowledge, I've been working in the utility industry since 2001. I've worked for state public utility commission. I've worked with Wall Street private equity funds for 6 years. I've worked with utilities for over a decade. and in Congress and federal agencies as well. And every industry changes, but the rate of change that we've seen in the last 20 years has been staggering. When I joined, the big issue was the integration of natural gas combined cycle plants. And that seemed like a huge transition, but it really wasn't. It was just shifting from predominant types of generation, primarily coal, to another base load plant using a different fuel and having different operational flexibility. What we're seeing now, though, completely upends the order. The system, every system is built with generation, transmission, and distribution. Distribution is what provides the service to homes and businesses. What we've seen in the last 10 years is the distribution element of the utility sector has become the primary point of change. And it's, you know, people obviously think of rooftop solar as the obvious piece and the emanation of distributed storage. But what's happening on the data side, from a simple thing that everybody is familiar with, the Nest thermostats, all the way to smart apps controlling the appliances throughout your home, and what's happening with data collection in utilities now, we're now able to fully watch the power supply and the power usage inside homes. And what I think is going to happen, it's beginning to happen now, but it will be the biggest change, is we're going to see a massive expansion in data companies. Silicon Valley people, I've met with them over the last few years. They're working extremely hard on developing apps and functionality to allow customers to completely control when they buy power, how they buy power, and when they have plug-in hybrid vehicles or storage in their homes or rooftop solar, when and how they sell power back onto the grid. That's all going to completely upend the vertically integrated utility model, the traditional model that we think about, where one entity builds the big generation, builds the transmission, puts in the distribution lines and meters, and then handles all of the customer interactions. That whole model is changing rapidly now, and I really believe, and I'm curious to see what Jose and the other participants on this call are seeing and hearing, but I think within the next 10 years, that entire model is going to evaporate in front of us. So I'll conclude there.
Great. So Jose?
Yeah, thank you. My apologies to everybody. Thank you for the invitation today. I agree with Paul. I also see that there are two areas. There's the physical component of what the infrastructure is going to look like, and then there's the actual financial and empowerment component, which is what a combination of what Paul has been saying. I see in the future giving more thought about making system resilient, which is strengthening the physical components of the system, as well as building a smart grid with all these apps that empower the consumer to be able to be not victims, but actors, fully participants of the whole energy market.
Great. Thank you. So
Yeah, and I agree. And that obviously poses massive challenges for Puerto Rico. Where the island is now, having to virtually rebuild everything would be hard. It would have been hard 25, 30 years ago. But now, unfortunately, Puerto Rican leadership, you're going to have to figure out, how do we rebuild the energy system at the exact same time that the whole system is being completely upended by data and technology? It's a profound challenge.
indeed. So moving on in terms of the changes, and I think we'll come specifically to Puerto Rico. Maybe I'll combine these questions, but what does this imply to you about the nature and requirements for energy regulation and for the regulator of the future?
I'll go first in deference to Jose's voice.
Thank you.
The number one essential element that I can't emphasize strongly enough is going to be flexibility. Obviously, Puerto Rico is going to have to make a choice very soon as to whether they want to move forward with the vertically integrated traditional model or have some approach towards the competition side where you allow different entities to build and supply energy. So that's a prerequisite step to make that choice. There are pros and cons to both. But regardless of what happens after that choice is made, every decision, every regulation, everything needs to be built with flexibility as a core attribute, because nothing is going to stay the same. There are rules pending on wheeling right now, which we've commented on. There's a lot of good things in there, a lot of great questions being raised, but the most essential component is everything's got to be written and built with the knowledge that every 3 or 5 years at the most, the regulators are going to have to rethink everything based on what data and technology is doing to change the world.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. I would just like to add two things. One, the essence of the regulator, I don't see it will change. The regulator's role is to extract performance. Now, the tools that the regulator will use to extract that performance are different on a competitive market structure than on a vertically integrated utility. And as soon as the technology speeds up and all these apps start happening and then the transactions are happening at the consumer level, it has to be much flexible and faster. But the essence of the regulator will remain the same. That is to make sure that the performance is there. It's just that the tools that the regulator might use definitely have to change.
Great. So maybe taking that into consideration and moving more specifically to Puerto Rico. Given where Puerto Rico stands, acknowledging that you have a situation where there was difficulty and bankruptcy and lack of maintenance in design of the system before the hurricane, and then Hurricane Maria pretty much took out the entire infrastructure, and it's been successfully patched back together. Given all of that, do you think that starting from now it might be harder or easier to evolve into the markets that you envision?
That's a good question. I think it makes life easier, which may sound counterintuitive, but what I'm seeing throughout the U.S. states is you run into questions of things like what are called stranded costs. So the utilities build the generation and transmission system thinking we're going to serve X amount of load, and then everything changes at the distribution level. So now they've got to deal with stranded costs in addition to just the legacy and inertia of changing what already is. So as maybe crazy as it sounds, I think Puerto Rico is in a way fortunate because you get to start with a greenfield approach to everything. It's unfortunate how it happened, but it did clear the table and allow you to begin figuring out what do we want to build that can sustain climate challenges, economic challenges, and this data technological tsunami going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. My feeling is that what Puerto Rico has right now, Puerto Rico is not the first jurisdiction that goes through a restructuring period. So there are multiple examples, in addition to what Paul said, that Puerto Rico can learn from the mistakes or the mishaps that other jurisdictions went through when they were doing its restructuring. We have in New York State, the Reform and the Energy Vision have been working on it for 2 or 3 years now. So there's a lot to be learned from there as well, so that we in Puerto Rico can incorporate the best outcomes of the jurisdictions once the market structure at which level is determined.
That makes a lot of sense. I think evidence is that, and I didn't. I'll add it because Paul didn't address it directly. But the other thing I think you don't see in Puerto Rico is the sorts of obstruction to new ideas or to actually testing or putting in new technologies on the ground, which in a more heavily regulated or let's just say functioning energy markets in the U.S. you see it from the government, you see it from the utility, and you see it from the PUCs, the public service commissions, who are reluctant to if you like, experiment or change. The prevailing attitude is it isn't broke, or at least it's not broke yet, so don't fix it. And that's a pretty powerful obstacle to implementing change. So what do you think is unique about about islands, and in particular Puerto Rico's likely priorities, and how should those inform its market design?
Well, the first thing is, you don't have interconnections with other states, but that's not completely unique. For example, Texas uses DC instead of AC for its transmission lines. And so Texas, although it's connected to several other states, actually is electrically a bit of an island. And so you get two things from that. One is, you don't have the ability to engage in interstate transactions to bring in or sell power. But the upside is, and Texas has really benefited from this, other people can't take your excess power. So in Texas, they've really focused on building massive amounts of wind, and with an open competitive market, now you see entities like Facebook, Walmart, investing huge amounts of money in renewable energy in Texas to serve themselves. So in a way, it does provide you a nice position, because you don't have to worry about market forces coming in and affecting the actual price and supply issues within your state.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. The interconnection is a challenge. It's one, then you don't have FERC regulations on top of you either. You have the PUC, the state PUC, but there are logistical challenges if you remain utilizing fossil fuels or any other type of fuel that you are not able to generate inland. So that creates
Right. So the follow-on, I think, from that is you know, what does this imply for, you know, the nature of well, best practice for energy regulation in Puerto Rico? I'll set this up and I'll give you a chance to rest your voice a little bit, Jose. There are a lot of competing plans in terms of resiliency and you know, restructuring the grid. Siemens has come out with a white paper and is talking about you know, 10 different resiliency microgrid zones. You know, that is one way of breaking up the island and looking at addressing resiliency and you know, the ability to recover within regions, so that a similar type of natural disaster might not the entire grid. That obviously relies on a number of investments and assumptions that it would need to inform regulation. It also informs privatization and the restructuring, et cetera. But any comments that you know, that sort of background, what it might imply for regulation and the regulator?
I'm going to defer to Jose first because he, you know, has been a regulator himself. So I'll jump in after.
Okay. Well, I see this, there are two different ways to look at it. One is the physical construction of the grid, and what are the natural, well, you could say natural microgrids, because the way of the infrastructure is set up. And then on the other side is, what is the financial arrangement, and what is the market structure or market zones or regions. So you could set up with what the 10 mini grids that Siemens have proposed. You could assign each area its own market. You have 10 distributed utilities that will participate in a wholesale market of competitive generation. Or the regulator needs to look at it closer and determine, well, this is the physical parameter up to this point. However, say the majority of the load, the demand is located on the north side of the island, 70% of it. So that's where the big chunk of the financial transaction happens. That's where the big chunk of the sale of energy happens. And the 30% is distributed for the rest of the island. Then does it make sense to split the island in so many financial grids versus the resilient grids? So it is something that I'll expect the regulator, the Energy Bureau, to take a look at that issue, how to harmonize the resilient physical component of the mini grids and the financial regions participating in a market.
Thanks.
Yeah, and when you set it up that way, then you actually sort of back into potentially the problem I alluded to that most U.S. states have, which is they're interconnected to other markets. And so then each market is then affected by price and supply and demand issues in the other markets. For example, I live in Arizona, and we benefit greatly from the incredible amount of solar that California has in place. California utilities are currently paying, you know, several $1 million a year to Arizona utilities to take excess power. Now you have to think about that. Like, Arizona is literally being paid to take free power. And so when you have those things, you create seams issues where one market is touching another. And, it's the first time I've heard about the amount of demand on the north side of the island versus the south side. So if you divided those regions up based on that demand, I don't know how you would avoid creating seams issues for yourself right away, and real challenges with, and I don't use this word in a derogatory way. Remember, I said earlier I worked for Wall Street for 6 years, but you create arbitrage situations where there's simply financial gains to be made from buying a product in one area where it's cheaper and then just putting it into another market for a higher cost. You don't really deliver any, there's no increase in production, no increase in capacity, but there's a financial gain to be made there, which is great, for what I used to do from a private equity position, but that doesn't help customers. So that's going to be that'll be a real profound challenge if the island decides to divide based on regions.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a challenging effort that is ahead of us.
Yes, I think, I think as both of you know, that, early on looking at the restructuring, it was all we've seen so far is indications that the generation would be sold, and that the transmission and distribution would be privatized along a concession line where effectively the physical assets rights would still technically belong to the state, but would be operated in some way, under custody by private or for-profit companies. This isn't that far away from some of the technical European models, but basically what we haven't seen is any detail beyond that. This is a workable outline, but coming back to your points, I think for 8-9 months now, assuming that this is the case, I've suggested, as have others, that we need to have transmission separate from distribution, and that I'd like to see more than one distribution company, not necessarily 10 regional distribution companies. I think they get a little small for interest, but say 3, maybe 4 distribution interest to allow you to look at the different parts of the island. San Juan is incredibly different from the south and west, as you were talking about, and having that sort of financial control, commercial control over an area can allow hopefully good regulation, competition and visibility and best practice between the regions, which the country and the regulator benefits from. But it also leads to a situation where, because we need to see a redistribution of generation away from the south to the north and into other areas of the country for resiliency and to help power these regions. This may help along those lines. I don't know if either one of you want to make a couple of specific comments, about that. That's kind of, my compromise as I look at it.
No, I don't think it's a bad idea. I'm just saying the complexity of that is really significant, and it's just one more thing for Puerto Rico to think about. But if you did it that way, it would allow investors to really focus on one area and one area's needs, and that becomes a lot simpler, I think, to market, because you're essentially selling like a service area right, and then the PREC would have to regulate it, but that is something that could attract investment.
Yeah, and the market needs to be designed properly so that, hello,
Yes,
something happened here.
we can still hear you, Jose.
You can hear me?
Yes. Now we can't. I think you just muted your phone, Jose. Okay. Well, while we look to get Jose back on the line, maybe well, actually, this is a good question for Paul, based on his activities, and maybe you can speak a little bit to some of the programs you've set up in Arizona. But basically the role of the regulator and regulation, should it be required to undertake, special measures in regard to the provision of electric service to low income and no income citizens?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look throughout the U.S., it doesn't matter whether a state uses the traditional vertically integrated model or relies on the market and competition. You have to have low income provisions. You have to have provisions in particular for rural areas and underserved areas. You can set that up one way or another. You could either have direct incentives to the customers or direct incentives to the providers. But I don't know of any state that takes a completely laissez-faire attitude to that question. Every state, regulated or competitive, has a lot of provisions there. One thing I would really recommend is that Puerto Rico enact what's known as a customer bill of rights. Not every state has that, but you see it quite often in competitive markets. But that allows the regulator to then have provisions that they can use to hold providers accountable for failing to serve customers, and you could and should include low income and underserved rural customers in that. And it allows the customers then to have a means, a simple, administrative, non-litigated means to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. So most public utility commissions have a simple administrative process that allows customers to file complaints under the Bill of Rights against their provider, and then have the commission or the regulator reach a decision on that. They can ameliorate or redress the problem. You can go farther. You could have, direct incentives of financial payments or direct subsidies to the utilities, but at a minimum, you have to, I think, begin there.
Yeah. Do you want to mention just briefly your work with Blue Collar Solar?
Sure. So through ConservAmerica, we've enacted a policy called Blue Collar Solar. We call it that. What it does is it allows regulated utilities to invest in rooftop solar for medium to low income people. In Arizona, we started it. There's a $45 million program. And what it does is it allows anyone whose household income is below the median level of income, median, of course, being half the people in the state make more than that, half make less. So anybody who's below the median can apply with the utility company to have the utility company put out an RFP to non-affiliated competitive solar rooftop installation companies. Those companies then go out, evaluate the roof, evaluate the structure, and write proposals for what kind of system could go on. The customer then selects the one that works. The utility company pays for it. The utility company owns it and has the obligation to maintain it, which matters here because we have a lot of really difficult storms, not hurricanes, but we get what are called haboobs, which are like massive dust storms that come in with sometimes 70, 80 mile an hour winds and huge hail. Puerto Rico, obviously you have constant challenge with weather. If the homeowner owns the rooftop solar and it gets damaged or destroyed, the homeowner has to pay for it. Now, if somebody's, wealthy or in the top half of income earners, they can maybe afford that. But low and middle income people, that's a real challenge. So under this model, the utility is responsible for it. Anything that happens to damage it, the utility fixes it. What the customer then gets out of it is a reduction to their monthly bill. In a way, they're leasing their rooftop to the utility company and getting a bill discount, $30 to $50, depending on the size of the system. It allows you then to make sure everybody benefits from solar installations, and it protects people who have lower income levels from the upfront cost of solar and the potential ongoing costs of solar. What we wanted to do was democratize solar. A study by the solar energy industry a few years ago found that 90% of rooftop solar was installed on the rooftops of the wealthiest half of Americans. And I don't like that personally. I don't think it's equitable. And in the long run, I don't think you can have that be an economic component. I don't think economies benefit from inequity over the long run. And so what we wanted to do was address all of those issues, and that's the way we did it. The utility company gets to make money by investing in it, gets the power, and the rooftop provides a direct financial benefit to the low and moderate income people who live there.
Great, thanks, Paul. And well, I think Jose was back, but I see and he is back.
Yes. Sorry about that.
No problem. Anything to add on that, or should we move on?
No, I think that the question that you asked Paul covered it perfectly.
Yep.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Good. Moving on then, we have privatization and restructuring, and they are all very much up in the air, so to speak. And maybe this is one more for you, Jose, given your background on the commission. The commission was set up, primarily to, you can describe it, but as I describe it, provide a balance to a government-owned utility, and provide some additional transparency, some guidance, and in particular provide an avenue of redress to the citizens. Given that now this is the regulator will be looking at private companies, not kind of part of its own network of the state. How do you think this changes maybe the organization of the regulator and the way it interacts with the market participants?
Well, it does. Like I said previously on the call, the role of the regulator will be the same. Is to extract performance, either on a competitive market structure or a monopolistic type of market structure, either public or private. The tools, however, to extract the performance will change. When you have a truly competitive market, if that's what we aspire and eventually happens, well-designed competitive market at the generation level, The role of the regulator is to make sure that no one has market power, that there are enough sellers or enough buyers so that it's an efficient marketplace and that nobody acquires market power after the fact. So it's more of an oversight of how the market is behaving more than a strict regulatory process on prices. So it is to determine the tools will change depending on the market structure, at which level is designed, and at which part of the company. We leave it at the wholesale level, just generation, but leave the T&D and a monopsony, and a monopsony is created. Then the regulation of the monopsony, or just a single buyer of this wholesale, of this market, PPAs, is different than the ones on the wholesale market. So it is going back to finding the tools to extract performance for the appropriate market structure. I don't, yeah, I think the regulator can look at other jurisdictions and incorporate best practices from other jurisdictions, even best practices that FERC has implemented. But I don't see at this point a benefit of having a FERC, even at a limited capacity, a FERC oversight on the energy infrastructure on the island.
Okay. That's jumping ahead, but that's a.
Oh, sorry, I just read it.
No, it's all right. I think that's fine.
That's a great answer too. That is a great
Yes.
answer in every element of that. I agree.
Do you? I assume this question has been here, but I assume you both agree that the regulator and regulation need to be transparent, and that the regulator should be independent from political and commercial interference, making no comments upon past or current administrations, but just as a general principle.
Yes.
Yeah, it's harder to achieve than to say, but yes.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And presumably we need to see larger budgets for regulation going and the regulator going forward than we've seen in the past.
Yes, I mean, the statutes typically put a lot of requirements on the regulator, but the budget doesn't match what the requirements are. So the regulator needs to be able to set up what's the working plan, what is going to be able to be completed, and when, and get the required budget to do so.
Yes, absolutely. I think as we've all heard and said before, the job doesn't get easier going forward. It gets harder.
Yes. Yes.
So I guess one last question here, and maybe we'll take questions. So if the folks on the call, there is a chat function. It's fairly easy to use if you can find it. If you have questions that you would like the speakers to answer, please submit them, and we'll try to answer them. So my last question is really around kind of bankruptcy and coming out of the bankruptcy. There's not a lot of faith, I guess, in the companies to pay. There's uncertainty around the transition and what may be necessary. There's clearly a need to move away from oil and gas. From oil, perhaps to gas, and build more distributed, centrally connected generation. There's a number of PPAs that have been waiting and are being renegotiated, we believe. But what sort of confidence, protections can a new, regulator offer to aid in this transition?
Well, the first thing is to, and I think Jose correctly alluded to this, work with other states and with something called NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and develop, a best practices model of regulation that has flexibility. And as Jose correctly mentioned, that working with the Puerto Rican government, ensure you have sufficient funding so you hire, the best people for the regulator jobs as you can. And then if you put in, as I said at the beginning, provisions that ensure regulatory flexibility. And we have comments that we submitted as well, things like a model that's used in Georgia on regulatory adjustments for investments. If you build that kind of structure, then the market will come. They will react to that. What markets can't do, the only thing they can't do is deal with uncertainty. But supply and demand is the core function of what markets do. And so if you create a mechanism and a regulatory structure that allows investors to say there is very little uncertainty here, we can price out what the risks are, we can see what supply and demand challenges are. We have a regulator who's going to be flexible and credible and talented. The market will come.
The question is regarding the confidence on the actions of the regulator or confidence on the market?
It's really about what can the regulator do to provide confidence to investors and lenders to support the new market.
It follows on, the regulator needs to act to that the investors know that everything is merit-based, really. Whoever provides the best service and the best product is really gonna get the market. And that's the regulator needs to show and keep showing that the decisions that they make are based on facts and logic and good market analysis, good economic analysis, that there is substance behind the decisions and that it is not influenced by outside priorities of the moment, but that there's a clear plan and a clear action that the regulator goes through and follows, and that it establishes a good recovery mechanism of the investments.
So could that be summed up as transparency, consistency, and independence?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Well, look, I think we'll turn to questions. We do have one, and I'll read them out. It says actually, hello, there's two questions, but let me read the first one, which is very simple. Is there a website where we can find more info about blue collar solar? I guess that's one for Paul.
There is, and I'm trying to find the link right now, and I will post that as soon as I find the link.
All right, so you'll post it in the chat box here on Zoom.
Yes, sir.
What will we be seeing after the co-ops were approved yesterday by the Puerto Rico Senate?
I have to go through the actual legislation and read it. I haven't read it. I believe it was signed into law yesterday. But we have to see how it develops. We have to see how the market develops on energy co-ops. If a community bands together and starts their own energy co-op, we have to wait who's going to be able to do it. So I am not able to provide a full answer until I actually go and read the legislation.
Yeah, and I think, and I'll probably give that same answer. I believe it's Bill 984. And to be honest, I wasn't aware that it was signed yesterday, just that it was coming and that it was trying to get through by the end of the month. But it's
it might be that might be
Yeah.
the case. I just read the heading of a news story. I haven't gone through it in detail yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, co-ops, it's very interesting. Obviously, there was no provision for electric co-ops before because there was an absolute monopoly. So when the original co-op laws were passed to set up things like co-op credit unions and other types of the water co-ops that have been allowed besides PRASA. Yeah, this we're looking at doing a lot in relation to co-op formation in Puerto Rico as part of the programs of the Fundación. There's something that we're adopting and building up called ACE-PR, which is the Asociación de Cooperativas Eléctricas de Puerto Rico. And we're not really limited to one way of thinking, right? Traditionally, when you think electric co-op, you think, rural, energy co-ops, people, binding together to kind of build an electric system and generation and balance and run their own wires, etc. And to me, that's 19th century thinking. Well, 20th century thinking, let's be honest. We don't need to do that. What we really need to do is to get people together and empower them. How they choose to exercise that power could be, in the first instance, as simple as just creating a group at scale that can allow for solar and storage to be purchased, installed, and managed behind the meter at the homes and businesses of co-op members. As a first principle, you don't need to control your wires. You need to be taking steps to empower and lower your cost of power, empower your citizens. And so there are many different ways that co-ops could be formed. And the first steps really are in nuts and bolts of getting them going. And that's one of the things that the Fundación is focused on rolling out in Puerto Rico. Another question: has CHP been considered to power Vieques and Culebra, or some other type of cogeneration?
I'm not familiar with what's live there, but for sure CHP, I'm sure it's got to be part of it.
CHP has been considered by industrial facilities, and there are some CHP type of microgrids being developed. To be honest, I don't see, and mainly on the residential sector, what the CHP will benefit. Like how CHP will benefit that client, how will they use the heat generated by the CHP. I'm sorry. My apologies. So I know there are RFPs for. Sorry, I can't talk anymore. I lost it.
No, sorry, Jose. I think Jose is right. There have been a couple of RFPs, and I think he's probably definitely closer to this. But you could also use the heat for chilling. So if you could put a chiller on that and create air conditioning. If there's nearby housing or stores or buildings or hotels that could be efficient. You know, at present, you're probably still powering CHP with oil. It would be more efficient, but it may not be the best long-term solution for Puerto Rico. Sorry, for Vieques or Culebra, or Puerto Rico for that matter. There are other types of small cogen that might be able to serve, you know, smaller wood waste units are an interesting phenomenon, I guess. But you could do these in as small as half a megawatt for facilities. But again, that probably doesn't translate into a great deal of resiliency or security for the residential population of Vieques or Culebra, which is, I think, what Jose was trying to point out. You know, solar storage, other types of solution probably have an ability to get at the need faster than some of these solutions, but they all need to be considered and integrated effectively to bring the kind of resilient system that I need. If someone can't find the chat function, if they want to you know, take themselves off mute and ask a question, now's the time to do it. Okay. Well, look, I want to thank everyone for joining, in particular Paul Walker and Jose Roman, who's come from an illness to join us, and I want to thank him for going the extra mile and joining this call, given that you see the state of his voice. I appreciate it very, very much. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone who's joined. I hope this was helpful. Oh, if you got the, sorry, Paul, you were saying?
Tom, is this site going to be available for a while? Because the link, I found the link, but I can't seem to get it to load. I'm going to post it.
Paul, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Aha. So it looks like the link to ConservAmerica and the blue collar solar was posted to chat. We'll pick it up off of there and make sure it gets circulated to everyone on the call as well. There was one last question actually added late from Michael Koskin. I don't know if we can answer it on here. Maybe we'll take it offline, and we'll look to get an answer around to people along with the link. All right. I want to again thank everybody, and there should be a recording of this presentation that we'll make sure to get up on the website in a few days' time. All right. Thank you very much.